Authorities in Los Angeles have been giving more details about their investigation into the deaths of the actor Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa.
Nobody expected the wall to move. The forensic photographer had been working her way through the private library methodically, cataloging, documenting, treating the room the way she treated every room at a death scene, as a record waiting to be read. She had worked cartel massacres. She had documented mass graves in 3 countries. She was not someone who startled easily. But when her knuckles grazed a section of mahogany paneling and the sound came back wrong, not the dense thud of solid wood but something hollow, something behind, she stopped. She pressed. A seam appeared where no seam should have been. The panel slid sideways with the quiet, practiced ease of a mechanism maintained in regular use. Cold air moved outward past her face. Not the stale, forgotten air of a sealed space, something else. Something that had been breathing behind the panel, a staircase, narrow, descending in a tight spiral, into absolute darkness. The stone steps were worn smooth, not by age alone, but by passage. Repeated, sustained, deliberate passage. Fresh electrical conduit ran along one wall. Whoever had built this had also been keeping it functional. She stood at the top of those stairs for 60 seconds, she would later say, before her training overrode what her body was telling her. Then she went down. The descent lasted nearly 15 minutes. 312 feet below the library floor of the Gene Hackman estate in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the staircase terminated at the entrance to a vaulted chamber 40 feet wide and 60 feet long. Arched ceilings in the style of late 19th century Spanish colonial construction. 47 wooden crates, most under thick layers of undisturbed dust. A far wall covered floor to ceiling in carved symbols that no one on the initial response team could identify. And at the far end, half concealed behind collapsed crating, an iron door 8 feet tall and 4 inches thick with no handle, only a locking mechanism built, by every indication, to remain permanently closed. This was February 26, 2025. Gene Hackman, 94 years old, one of the most decorated actors in American film history, had been found dead in his home, along with his wife, Betsy Arakawa. The official cause, cardiovascular disease, with Alzheimer's as a contributing factor. Natural causes, unremarkable. The kind of finding that closes a case before anyone has time to ask the harder questions. The harder questions were already waiting 312 feet below the library floor. The property nobody fully understood. The Hackman estate covered 23 acres of high desert terrain on the outskirts of Santa Fe. From the road, it looked like what it was supposed to look like, the private retreat of a wealthy and intensely reclusive public figure, someone who had spent the second half of his life in deliberate withdrawal from the industry that made him famous. Look closer, and the picture changed. 12-foot stone walls. Reinforced gates. Motion sensors integrated with thermal cameras positioned to eliminate blind spots. A security infrastructure that Richard Castellano, a consultant with a background in diplomatic protection and defense contractor security, reviewed in 2019 at the request of an unnamed party. He expected celebrity-grade precaution. What the documentation described was something different in kind, not just in degree. This wasn't celebrity paranoia, Castellano said afterward. The design philosophy here matched what you'd see protecting a diplomatic installation or a classified research facility. Government-grade infrastructure installed inside a private residential property, end quote. The construction contractor Michael Rise had worked foundations and structural work across Santa Fe for 30 years when he was brought to the Hackman property in the early 2000s. He described walls in the lower levels measuring 18 inches thick. Standard residential construction uses 6-inch walls. 8 inches for high-end builds. 18 inches is bunker specification. I asked what it was for, Rise recalled. They said storage. I've poured a lot of concrete. You don't build storage to those specifications unless what you're storing needs to survive something catastrophic. He was paid triple his standard rate. He signed a non-disclosure agreement with a 20-year term. That agreement expired in 2024, 12 months before the deaths were discovered. He worked only one section of the property. Other contractors, people he never met, handled the deeper work. He was told the lower levels didn't exist. That instruction was repeated to him more than once, which suggested that someone was uncertain whether once would be sufficient. A history designed to disappear before Gene Hackman, before the walls and the cameras and the contractors sworn to silence about floors that officially weren't there. The land itself had a history that had been carefully managed toward illegibility. Historian Dr. Elena Vasquez spent several months tracing the property's ownership record and described what she found as a deliberate obscuration. 7 ownership changes between 1920 and 1965, each one routed through shell companies, anonymous trusts, or documentation thin enough that the identifying details dissolved on examination. The paper trail was not absent. It was present in exactly the way that produces the appearance of a record while containing nothing useful. Geological surveys conducted in the late 1940s were consistently incomplete. The surveys that covered the relevant portions of the property stopped, in each case, before reaching conclusions. One surveyor who had visited the site in that period died in a car accident several weeks after his final documented visit. The timing was noted in the historical record. No connection was ever formally established. The question of who built the tunnel, and when, and why, and for whom, is the question that everything else orbits. The arched ceilings in the chamber below suggest construction methodology consistent with the late 19th century, possibly earlier. If accurate, the structure predates Hackman's ownership by at least 70 years, and likely predates the earliest shell company transactions in the ownership record. Someone built this before the paper trail begins. Someone built it before the people who used the paper trail to conceal it were involved. Investigative sources familiar with the case believe that Hackman did not discover the tunnel accidentally or inherit it as an unknown feature of a property he purchased for other reasons. The evidence, they suggest, points toward a deliberate acquisition. A wealthy, famous, deeply private man choosing this specific piece of land because of what was underneath it, and accepting the role of its custodian as part of the transaction. A public face above ground, silence below. What the chamber held. The 47 wooden crates found in the vault represented the most immediate objects of forensic interest, and also the ones about which the least has been publicly disclosed. Most were undisturbed, their surfaces covered in the kind of even, layered dust that accumulates over decades without interference. Several were not. Near a cluster of crates in the northeast quadrant of the chamber, the dust had been recently disturbed. Footprints, partial but legible enough to establish recency, indicated that someone had moved through that section of the vault not long before the February discovery. One opened crate contained a leather-bound ledger dated 1947. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, names, dates, and numerical figures, all in German. The ledger has never been publicly acknowledged by any agency involved in the investigation. Its contents have not been described in any official communication. It exists in the documentary record only through the accounts of people who were present when it was found. A second crate held 63 photographs printed on paper stock, consistent with mid-20th century production. The subjects were men in military uniforms that analysts have been unable to definitively identify. The settings appeared to be interior spaces, rooms with specific but unidentifiable architectural features. The gatherings depicted suggested formality, occasion, significance. In most photographs, certain faces had been removed with what was described as surgical precision, cut out cleanly, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly which individuals needed to be absent from the record. One photograph showed a group of men standing at what appeared to be the entrance to a tunnel. 2 faces were missing from that image. The ledger and the photographs together described something that was being tracked and documented in 1947 by people who also understood, at some level, that documentation created exposure. They recorded. They also redacted. The combination suggests an organization that required internal record-keeping for operational purposes while simultaneously managing the risk that those records might eventually be examined by someone outside the organization. The symbols. The carved symbols on the far wall of the chamber were the finding that most consistently stopped people in their tracks during the initial investigation, and the one that has proven most resistant to analysis. They covered the stone from floor to ceiling in a dense, continuous field, not scattered or decorative, but systematic, like a document. Some elements resembled the symbolic vocabulary of medieval alchemy, transmutation symbols, elemental notations, the kind of visual language that circulated among natural philosophers in the 15th and 16th centuries. Others looked more like technical diagrams than mystical notation, schematics of some kind, suggesting function and mechanism rather than meaning and metaphor. A third category matched nothing in any reference system that researchers brought to the problem were able to consult. Not historical, not occult, not scientific in any tradition they could locate. Astrophysicist Dr. Marcus Webb spent 3 weeks analyzing photographic documentation of the wall. Certain configurations of symbols, he concluded, aligned with stellar positions, but the positions they described were not current, and not from any era within the historical period suggested by the chamber's construction. The orbital mechanics encoded here are consistent with sky configurations from approximately 12,000 years ago, he said. Then, after a pause, or 12,000 years from now, the mathematics works in both directions, and the level of astronomical precision involved is not consistent with any documented civilization from the period suggested by the architecture. 3 interpretive frameworks have been proposed by researchers who have studied the documentation. The first, the work of an obsessive individual, a wealthy eccentric with access to diverse esoteric knowledge, who used the chamber as a private repository for a lifetime of collection and study. The second, an encoding system, a set of symbols designed to communicate specific information to a specific audience who already possessed the context required to interpret it. The third, and the one that researchers have found most difficult to dismiss entirely, evidence of knowledge that predates the civilization responsible for the physical structure. Information preserved across an interval of time long enough that the gap between the people who originated it and the people who recorded it here represents something closer to archaeology than to inheritance. No consensus has been reached. The symbols remain officially undeciphered. The iron door, everything in the chamber, the crates, the ledger, the photographs, the symbols, served in some sense as context for the object at the far end of the vault. The iron door stood 8 feet tall and 4 inches thick. Rust had worked its way into the surface over what appeared to be a very long period of exposure to the chamber's cool, damp air. There was no handle on the external face. The locking mechanism was heavy, integrated into the door's structure, and built in a manner that suggested the intent was permanence rather than security. Not a door designed to be opened under controlled circumstances, but one designed to remain closed. An agent present during the initial discovery, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the effect of the door on the people in the room. "We thought we understood the place. We'd been moving through it for hours. Then we came around those crates and saw the door, and everyone just stopped. It felt like it had been waiting there longer than any of us had been alive." Thermal imaging equipment deployed in the chamber produced a finding that became the center of subsequent debate about the investigation's direction. There was airflow on the other side of the door, not residual, active, continuous airflow, indicating that the space beyond the door was extensive, connected to something larger, and in some respect still functioning. The chamber the investigators were standing in was not the end of whatever this was. It was an anteroom. The iron door has not been opened. No official explanation for this decision has been provided. The FBI has declined to comment on the investigation's status. Formal requests for information have been denied on the grounds of an ongoing investigation into what is officially characterized as a natural death case, a categorization that sits uneasily alongside the documented existence of a 312-foot tunnel, 47 crates of unacknowledged materials, undeciphered symbols, and a sealed iron door with active airflow behind it. The neighborhood and the nights. Maria Sandoval had lived on the property adjacent to the Hackman estate for 15 years. In 2017, her dog woke her at 2 in the morning. The specific, insistent kind of alerting that meant something outside the normal range of nighttime sounds. She went to the window. What she heard was a deep mechanical hum rising from underground. It persisted for approximately 20 minutes and then stopped. She had no framework for it at the time and described it to a neighbor the following day, who had noticed nothing. She filed it in the category of inexplicable minor experiences and moved on. Other residents of the surrounding area reported other things over the years. Unexplained vibrations in the ground, particularly at night. Trucks arriving at the property in the early morning hours, with cargo that left no visible trace. Power fluctuations in the neighborhood that appeared, when residents tracked them, to originate from the direction of the Hackman property. Several people described seeing Hackman himself standing on the grounds in the pre-dawn hours, motionless, looking at a specific area of the property that later investigation would identify as the location of the tunnel entrance. Former household staff members have, in the period since the deaths became public, become difficult to locate. Several who were identified through employment records stopped responding to researchers' inquiries. At least 2 appear to have changed their contact information in the period following February 2025. This pattern is not conclusive of anything. It is also not consistent with the response of people who have nothing to conceal. The timeline that doesn't add up. Betsy Arakawa, Hackman's wife, is believed to have died around February 3, 2025. Her body was not discovered until February 26, a gap of approximately 3 weeks during which, according to the estate's own surveillance infrastructure, the property's internal camera system experienced a failure that corrupted the recordings covering that period. External cameras continued to function normally. The external footage that survived showed lights moving through the interior of the house during the period when both occupants were dead. Movement patterns that did not correspond to the erratic or random motion of malfunctioning electrical systems, but to the purposeful navigation of someone who knew the layout of the space and was moving through it with intention. The internal cameras failed. The external cameras worked. The footage that was captured showed activity inside a house where no living resident remained. The security system that Castellano had described as government-grade, a system with no blind spots, produced a gap precisely where a gap was most consequential. Hackman's final weeks, reconstructed through physical evidence at the scene, appear to have been characterized by a specific kind of activity. Documents in the study had been sorted and reorganized, not casually but systematically, in a pattern that investigators described as someone controlling a record, managing what would and would not be accessible. The furniture displacement documented by the forensic photographer on arrival was inconsistent with the mobility limitations of someone in the late stages of Alzheimer's disease. Someone had been moving through that house with more purpose than the official medical narrative suggested. The working interpretation among investigators is that Hackman, in his final period of functional awareness, was doing what someone in his position would do when time was running out, managing the information he was responsible for, making decisions about what remained exposed and what stayed protected, preparing for a transition he knew was imminent. What happened to the property? The speed with which the legal and financial architecture around the Hackman estate moved after the deaths became a matter of interest to anyone tracking the case. Transfer paperwork for the property was filed while the investigation was still formally active. The buyer was an anonymous trust registered in the Cayman Islands, a structure specifically designed to shield the identity of beneficial owners from public disclosure. The transaction moved with an urgency that did not match the pace of a standard estate proceeding, particularly one complicated by an ongoing federal investigation. Every formal information request filed regarding the investigation, the contents of the chamber, and the disposition of the 47 crates has been denied. The stated grounds in each case: ongoing investigation. The investigation is into natural deaths. Natural deaths do not typically generate the volume or persistence of federal information restriction that this case has produced. The 1947 German ledger is in federal custody. It has not been publicly acknowledged. The photographs with the surgically removed faces are in federal custody. They have not been publicly described. The symbols have been photographed and documented. The documentation has not been released. The iron door remains sealed. The new owners, whoever they are, shielded behind a Cayman Islands registration, want access to the property immediately. The airflow continues in whatever space exists beyond that door. The shape of the question taken individually. Several elements of this case have explanations that don't require anything beyond the unusual. Wealthy recluses build elaborate security. Old properties contain architectural surprises. Documents in foreign languages accumulate in estates with complicated histories. Security systems fail. Taken together, in sequence, the elements of the Hackman case describe something that doesn't have an innocent explanation sitting readily available. A tunnel predating ownership by 7 decades, built to bunker specifications, maintained in active use. 47 crates of materials from the mid-20th century, at least some of which document organizational activity in German in 1947. photographs with specific faces deliberately removed, symbols that an astrophysicist with no apparent motive for sensationalism described as encoding astronomical knowledge that should not exist in this form, in this place, from this period. An iron door built to stay closed, with active airflow behind it, indicating that whatever exists on the other side is still, in some functional sense, operating. A famous man who chose this property deliberately, maintained it for decades, and spent his final weeks of functional awareness managing the record of what it contained. A buyer who materialized quickly, identity shielded, wanting access now. The question of who built the original tunnel is unanswered. The question of who compiled the 1947 ledger is unanswered. The question of whose faces were removed from those photographs is unanswered. The question of what knowledge the symbols encode is unanswered. The question of what lies beyond the iron door is unanswered. The question of what the new owners want from this property and why they want it with such urgency is unanswered. What is answered, documented, physically present, acknowledged by the federal agents who entered that chamber on February 26, 2025, is that something has been here for a very long time, that it was considered important enough to protect with extraordinary resources across multiple generations of custodians, and that the most recent of those custodians spent his last coherent days ensuring that the wrong people would not reach what was waiting 312 feet below his library floor. The iron door is still closed. Whatever is behind it is still there. The people who just acquired the property are already asking to be let in. These three facts, in combination, suggest that the question of what Gene Hackman spent his life guarding may be about to stop being a question.